this new tutorial from Airbush One Studio. Hi, I'm Lonnie Bush, and today we're going to build this clone logo reveal from the ground up. But first I wanted to show you a couple of cool things you can do with this. So this is another variation on the same idea. Here we have cubes into a cube object, and this is my logo being formed out of spheres. So what we're going to do is have these spheres kind of swirl around and end up in this cylindrical or circular shape at the bottom to reveal our logo. But as you saw in my logo, my Airbush One Studio logo, that that shape could be anything at the bottom. It doesn't have to be a cylinder or a square. It could be any shape you can think of. You use a spline and extrude it. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So I've got a new document open here, and the first thing we want to do is we need to create an object to guide these spheres where we want them, to have them swirl around and then end up in this cylindrical shape. And for that, I'm going to go up here to Mograph, and I'm going to grab a matrix object. All right, and let's go in there into the Object tab, and let's turn the grid array into radial. All right, and then in XZ space, we'll give that 2 more, and let's give it a starting radius of 100, I think. Yeah, that looks good. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to use this matrix object to draw out some splines in the shape we need them. So in order to do that, we've got to animate this matrix object. So enough talk, I'll get going. So let's give this 50 frames. And just let me explain something real quick about we're going to use the tracer object, okay, this tracer. And something to keep in mind when you're using that is that Cinema lays down a point for every frame. So when you're drawing something out, you animate an object like you'll see in a minute, it'll make more sense. It's going to put down a point for every frame, okay? Sometimes you need a lot of points. In this case, we don't. Probably don't even need 50, but I'm going to go ahead and stay with that. Actually, let's make it 49 so that is just 50 frames. Anyway, and that'll give us a little bit less geometry when we form our object for guiding these spheres. So first we need to figure out how we want this to happen. And I want this to turn so that we actually have a twisting spline. So what I'm going to do is if I go into the Coordinates tab, oops, let me pull this out a little so we can see this. And if you see, if I turn this in H, you can see that those twist around. So that's what we need to do. So first off, before we go too much further, there's a few things. Up in your Animate tab, come down to Play Mode, and all we want is simple. All right, because we want this to be able to stop at frame 49 so that we don't get splashed back on our tracer object and all that. So what we want to do is let's first off set a keyframe in H, and then we can just click this arrow, go to the end, and let's set this to be 110 degrees. All right, so if we play that, okay, we can see it turns all the way. We're going to make some adjustments even to the animation. The other thing we want to do is this to raise up, okay, because we want these spheres to funnel down into our cylinder. So let's undo that. And in Y, let's set a keyframe right there. Go to the end. And I've already pre-done this, obviously. Let's make it 600 in Y. And of course you can, change this up or whatever you want, but I'm going to stay with how I did the original one. The other thing we want to do is as this is raising up and turning, we want these matrices to actually spread out. So if we come back into our matrix object and we see our radius, that's what we want to happen. So let's go back to 100. I'm going to set a keyframe there. We're going to go to the end, and let's make this an even 1,000. All right. So they're spread out pretty good. So if we watch this, pull this back, you can see they're turning. they're going out, they're going up, and we'll get some nice splines. All right. So there's one other thing we want to, well, there's actually a few other things we want to do. For the matrix object, let's go up to Mograph, want an effector, and what we want is a random effector. And you can see that we've got our matrices pretty randomized, but I think they're too much. Okay, so I'm going to put 20 in X, we'll leave 50 in Y, and let's put 0 in Z. Okay, so now they're, a little bit of variation, but this is the variation I'm really interested in, is height, just so that we have the clones moving at different speeds down the chutes and all that. Okay, but we don't want to start in this position, all right? So what we're going to do, instead of animating these two parameters, we're going to go in just the Effector tab, and we're going to dial this down to 0. So now everything's back to normal. And let's go ahead and set a keyframe there. Go to the end, and we have to zoom out. And these are kind of hard to see, but I am going to use minus 500. Okay? And you'll see that even though we're not using the parameter tab, by dialing in different numbers into the strength, it goes beyond 100% in either direction. And it's really a nice thing to know when you want to animate your random effector in some way, but you don't want to go in and animate every parameter, as you had rotation and scale and all of that, when you can just animate the strength. So if I dial this backwards, we'll see that they slowly come back to where they're supposed to be. And we've got our spiral spline maker ready. So before we call our tracer object to trace this matrix object, I want to change the interpolation of our animation. So I'm going to go up to the window and bring down the timeline F curve so we can look at this. And you can see that all our parameters, let's go in here and just select everything and then hit S to frame everything. Everything kind of starts off slow, then it picks up speed, and then it slows down, which is going to change how the points on the tracer object are distributed. So there'll be wider gaps here, they'll be closer together here, they'll be wider there. For what we're doing, it probably doesn't matter, but it's a good thing to be aware of, and I really want this matrix object to rise at the same speed, and all throughout from 0 to 49 I want the matrices to spread out uniformly. So what we're going to do is, right now they're to the soft interpolation. Let's just go here to linear, and now everything moves at a constant speed. So we can close that. You probably can't even see a difference. Well, you kind of do. See how it kind of jumps. It looks like it's jumping faster, but actually it's all moving at the same speed, and that's really what we want. So let's select the matrix object, go up to Mograph, and let's get a tracer. All right, and everything should be kind of set. Now, because we have gone up to animate and put our play mode to simple, we can just pretty much let this run, and it'll stop. And that looks pretty good. All right. So we've got a nice spiral shape. We've got our 7 streams for spheres, and we have some variation. They all end in the same place, but they don't all start in the same place. So I'm real happy with that. So what we want to do is, we don't want this to keep tracing every time, because this is just for building our model. But I don't want to lose my tracer, so I'm going to select it, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go current state to object. You could make it editable, and that would be fine, but you'll have to start over if you have a problem and you want to do this again. So current state to object gives me a tracer object, and I'm going to switch off this tracer, and I'm going to switch off the matrix. Okay, and if I go back to 0, you can see I can hit play, and this set of splines is fixed now. So if you've watched my tutorials before, you know I do like to try to keep things like cleaned up. So let's get a null object and we'll bring it down here. We can turn this random effector off now too. And we'll stick it in this null object along with the tracer. And we'll just call this spline builder, whatever you want to call it. You can just leave it blank too if you want. Okay, because we're not going to need that anymore, hopefully. So we've got our tracer, and let's go ahead and build our, what do we need? A sweep object. All right. So we're going to throw that tracer in there, and instead of using a circle, let's just go ahead and use this end side. And we'll take this down in size a little bit for now. We're probably going to raise it back up, and go ahead and give it 16 sides. All right. And we're going to throw that in here, and we suddenly have a weird little object. So, so we don't forget, we want to remove the cap here because this is where our spheres are going to come out. So let's go into our sweep, go into caps, and that is actually the start, I believe. So we'll say none, okay? And then, but we still have our cap here. All right. So what I want to do though is I don't want this the same size all the way down. And you'll see why is we're going to push all the clones up into these end sections, and I'll call them the explosion sections, okay? So because these splines are going to be, or I'm sorry, the spheres are going to be grouped tightly, and they're going to explode when we hit play, and we want a container large enough that it doesn't force them outside of it, but then they get funneled down as they go. So let's stop talking and start doing. And in the sweep object, you can, everything up here is fine, but we want to go into our scale in the details tab. If that's closed, just roll it open. And I'm going to, first off, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to click and say select all. All right, and we want point types 0 angle length, I think. Yeah, that gives us like a linear point type. And let's pull, oops, let's deselect, and let's pull this first point down to about, it would be 0.2 on this side. So just between here and the bottom. And then this one can stay where it is. And so if you hold down Control and you click on this line, you're going to set a point. So I'm going to click here on 0.4 right there, and I'm going to point type that, point type 0 angle length, and I'm going to pull that down to around 4. Okay, you can kind of see what's happening here. And then I need another point at about 0.5. So in here, so just control click, come down and point type 0 angle length. And let's pull that up to maybe around, let's see, yeah, around 6 or so. I'm actually going to pull this over towards 6 and then pull this one over a little bit. I'm kind of changing up from how I originally did it, but that's all right. Okay, so that is looking good, but of course these are way too small. So what we want to do is go back into our end side spline, and let's go ahead and put that back to 200 now. And the only thing I care about is, well, a lot of things, but I don't really want these to intersect. And so that's actually looking pretty good. And we got some nice big explosion sections up here. So I think that's going to work. That's going to work really well. So I'm going to show you, if we do go into lines, you see that all these polygons, all these lines drawn across, come from the spline, and you can see how even they are. If we had not changed the interpolation of the animation to linear, they would be spread out wider here, tighter here, and then wide again. Anyway, I wanted to show you that. But there's a bigger thing that I need to do, and that is save this project. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to save it to my desktop and just call it clone logo reveal. Okay, and if you haven't saved yours, please do now. Okay, so let's grab our sweep object and let's go in here and use X-ray. All right, and even though we can't see the spline, it is there. All right. So what we need now is go into Mograph and let's get a cloner. And let's go into our objects and grab a sphere. And let's make that sphere 16 centimeters radius. It's down there somewhere. Okay. All right. Put it in the cloner. And if we go into our cloner object tab, let's select object. All right. And let's clone our spheres onto this tracer object. Okay, and good. So we can see those even though we can't see our tracer. And when you see what's happening, it's treating this tracer as one object, but it's also treating it as 7 objects, so which is exactly what we want. It's cloning right now exactly 10 spheres onto each of our splines. All right. Now, I'm going to end up with 150 spheres on each spline. If you're, on limited resources on a laptop or something, that may be overkill. I don't know. I'm going to go to 100 right now. All right. So just use whatever you can comfortably. And so what we want to do is we want to offset these, all right? And for some reason, oh, I know why, because that's not what we want to do. We want to change the start and end position. All right, I want to get all of these clones up into this like explosion chamber. All right, so I'm going to change my start, and let's get it up into here. And you can already see like this is going to be quite a situation when we make these dynamic. And so I'm going to pull this back a little too from the end. Okay, and because I don't really want this explosion to be like this dramatic, which it will be with 100, and I'm going to increase this to 150 soon. 100 clones all intersecting. Let's go ahead and get another random effector. All right, and with the cloner selected, come down and get a random selector. And that actually is pretty good. Okay, so they're a little more spread out, not going to be quite as crazy. We'll get some explosion, but it shouldn't be too bad. And so now I'm going to go ahead and put in 150. And it seems that the 50, let's see, the default settings in the random select or the random effector seem to be fine. 50, 50, 50. Nothing is coming out of that chamber. I do want some explosion because I really want to randomize these spheres as much as possible. Now at this point it doesn't matter, but it will matter later on. All right, so we don't get confused later on. Let's go ahead and rename the random effector to random spheres. Cloner, maybe. Cloner spheres. So we know what that is. And let's go ahead and make our spheres dynamic and see how this is going to work. So with the cloner selected, let's go down to Cinema Simulation, choose Rigid Body, go into our Inherit tag, say apply tag to children and all. Right, but we also need to make our sweep, our object dynamic, our chute object. So let's go back into simulation, collider body, and here we want to make sure that our shape is static mesh. Now we can use static mesh because the shape itself is not going to move, so that's good. And we cross our fingers and hit play. And all that looks good so far. And we have spheres going down the chute, and that's over. So let's go back and give our animation line here, let's say 300. All right, so that's looking good. All right, we've got some good interaction. Everything's going down the chute. And all right, so let's add just another 100 on there real quick. Oops, make it 400 total. Make sure you pull it out. Let's keep that running. Yeah, so we've got some spheres hanging up, which, it's not the end of the world, but actually it could cause us problems later on, although probably not. But we want them all to come out. And so the problem is when in the sweep object, when I created too hard of an angle here is the problem. So let's go back and let's just pull this over a little bit. Okay, maybe up a little bit. And let's just try this again and see how it works. And of course, as always, we don't know until after 300 frames. But oh, it's already looking better. Okay, so that's what we want, and that's good. So it actually cleared out a little earlier too. So let's go back to 300 frames because we really want this to happen in less than 10 seconds. So that all looks really good. So let's go ahead and get our catcher cylinder, come up to the primitives, grab a cylinder, and let's give that about a 340 radius. The 200 in the height should work. And let's just see the lines. I do like to give this more rotation segments, so I'd give it about 108. And then let's give this 8 height segments. I don't know if it makes a difference as far as the dynamics is concerned to keep things from bleeding out, but let's go ahead and do that. That's weird. I don't know why that's not centered, but let's go ahead and go into F2 top view and okay, back to F1. All right, and let's go ahead and the cylinder, go into caps and just get rid of the caps. And in the yeah, that's probably going to be okay. I'm just going to raise this up a little bit. And go in F3 just a little bit. Okay, so of course this isn't going to work the way it is because everything's just going to go right out the bottom. And we could have just converted this and gotten rid of the top, but if you want to be able to animate this and corral the spheres in, then it's nice to leave it as a parametric object. But we're not going to do that, but I'm going to leave it this way anyway. So let's get a plane and let's go back into top view so we can get that centered on there. I don't know why that's off center. And we just need to pull this out so it completely encompasses the bottom. Go into F3 and just pull that down. I'm going to leave it slightly above the bottom. And that should do it. And we can go ahead and make that a child of the cylinder so they're together. There's no other reason. And go into simulation and we want collider body. And in automatic we want again static mesh because we're not going to move it. But if you were going to move that, animate that cylinder radius, then you would want moving mesh. And let's see. I'm going to hold down Control and then click and drag to copy this tag. And so let's just run this and see what we get. And see if everything stays in the sphere or in the cylinder. All right, I got to shut these lines off. I can't stand it. Okay, so it looks like all right, so it does look like everything's in there. So I'm gonna go in and hide all of that. Yeah, the height's okay. I mean, we could even make the cylinder bigger if we wanted. We have plenty of coverage for it. So why don't we do that and make it, we're gonna see it now. Okay, make it, let's try making it 360 or even 370, and we'll try it again. This does take a little bit of time going through each of these and making sure everything's working and how it's looking at the end. But in a minute we'll be able to do this a little quicker. Alright, looks like by 300 they've all settled down even before that. And that actually looks really good, I think. Alright, so that's good. So let's go ahead and got that. I'm going to pull that down here by the sweep. And we want to go ahead and hide the sweep as well. So all we have are our clones. And what I want to do is go ahead and go into the cloner tab and go into the dynamics tab rather, into the cloner object, and go ahead and let's bake this, okay? And this is going to take a few minutes. Okay, so we're back, and now we can just run this through like so. And that's all looking real good. So I'm real happy with that. So now that we have our setup, we need to convert these spheres so that we can texture them with our logo or whatever we want to texture them with. So in order to do that, we've got our clone here with the sphere, and we can't really do much with that. We can't do what we need to do for sure. So what I want you to do is select that cloner and right click and come down to current state to object. All right. And what that's going to do is that's going to create a cloner null with all our spheres in it. Okay. And if we if we middle mouse click that, you can see up here in our attributes manager there are 1051 elements, 1051 spheres. All right. So one of the first things I want to do is I want to select and get rid of all these texture tags because we're not going to use those. So if you click the top one and you pull this down and hold shift, I don't know if it's the same on a PC or not. Anyway, select all those and then just hit delete. So we got rid of that. The next step is we need to create a material, all right, to map onto our clones. And I'm going to go over to Photoshop, and this is what I used, and this is what I'm going to use. And if you notice, I've got a lot of extra color out to the sides, and that's so that it colors all the clones, so they either are the logo or they are this red. All right. So you might want to think about that as you're creating a graphic that you want to put on here. And it's also, let's see here. Oops, it's 1152 by 1152 pixels. I don't know why I made it such a strange size, but you probably want to make it like 1024 or something like that. 1024 by 1024. Regardless, you want it to be square, is going to be the best for this particular project. So I'm going to go back to Cinema, and I'm going to double click and create a texture. And in this tutorial, I'm not going to get a lot into the finished look of it. I'll give you a couple of clues though about certain things that you might want to do in order to make it look a little better. Anyway, let's go in here and into the text and grab this bullseye logo ping. That's what I'm using. No, we're not going to do that. Okay, and so what I want to do is, first off, okay, I got a little bit ahead of myself, but it's okay. This is something we still need to do, is to create this texture. But before we do that texture, we need to make these spheres dynamic, okay? In other words, I'm going to deselect these, and if I hit play, you're going to see nothing happens. That's because these spheres aren't dynamic yet. So I'm going to take this tag, and again, I'm going to hold down Control and click the tag and drag it onto the cloner, okay, the cloner null. And I'm pretty sure that our baking won't work. No, it won't because it's not baked anymore. You see there was a bit of a lag, and that's because we're using actual polygon objects now. So this is really going to slow down with our dynamics tag. So this is going to be another case where before we go forward, because we can't work like this, we have to bake this tag again. All right, we baked it for our cloner, but now we have to bake it for our live spheres. So let's go in there, and I am going to cut away again because this will take even longer than the cloner did. So hit bake object, and we'll let that go a little bit. Okay, so this is almost done, and I should do it. It's using up 41 megabytes of memory. But what it does is, again, it allows us to move through this without waiting around. Okay. And so now, because that's baked, we can go ahead and turn off these objects, the sweep, the end side, and the tracer. And we no longer need, now I'm not getting rid of them, I'm just turning everything off. The cloner and the plane, we don't need that. And we can even move this cloner down, and that's all off. So that's good. And I'm going to hide that just in case. And so now we've got our spheres, and they're all baked. And now we're ready for our texture. Before we do the texture, because our final position of the clones is really dependent somewhat on our camera position. So let's set up a couple of cameras. Okay, so let's grab a camera, and you can set these up any way you want, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting this first part set up like I did for my intro tutorial. The nice part is now we got this baked, you can just quickly see. Like I don't like that showing up, that drop, the initial drop. But yeah, that looks cool. It needs to be over somewhat. Maybe in closer. Let's see. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I'm good with that. It's not quite centered. Uh, okay, that works. Works for me. So I'm going to go ahead and protect that camera so we can't move it by accident. And I'm going to grab another camera. And this one is the one that we want for our final spot. And of course I screwed up a little here and need to go into the oh boy, where are they? Render settings right here. And I didn't change this. I guess we should do that real quick. I'm going to leave it at 800. I don't care for that about that right now. Okay, and so that may be a little close, but that looks pretty good for the second camera. Let's go back to the first camera and see where we are with this. Yeah, that's not working so good anymore, is it? So let's okay. Let's move the protection tag to the first one because I know that one's working. So what we want to do is You know, we could even tilt this a little, although it's got a nice angle to it. Maybe tilt it a little. I didn't do that with mine, but all right, and let's back it up. Okay, cool. So everything is maybe a little higher. Okay, I don't want to waste a lot of time on this. Getting this set up, I mean, you'll do whatever you want on this. And then let's just move that over so we're kind of in the center. Let's see. All right, that's good enough for now. And let's go ahead and protect that camera. And I'm going to move that on top. And I'm going to grab that camera and that camera. And I'm going to go over here and create camera. And we're just going to do a simple morph of these cameras. So let's start here and go to the final and like so, and hit a keyframe. And you just got to remember to switch on the morph camera. You didn't see it change because I didn't have the morph camera switched on. And so we're starting and we're forming our circle and our final resting position. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to save. And now let's create a plane. Okay, and I'm going to pull that up a little. We want it above the clones. And let's actually go into top view for now. F2 to get this set up a little bit. I'm going to go into garage shading. And again, let's try to get this centered as best as possible. And just pull it out that it covers the ends of our clone circle. Oops. All right, let's go back in F1. And I'm going to put that in X-ray mode. All right, so that looks good, sort of. And let's rotate. I'm going to try to line this up even with the top and bottom of my viewport. So pull this down a little bit. You can see it's extended over. Now, you'll see that you're able to adjust all this later if you want, but I'm going to try to get it as close as possible. Now, you see we've got a bit of perspective here. That's not going to kill us, all right? But I think I am going to adjust that a little bit. Actually, it's camera 1. Get rid of that tag for a minute. And make sure you switch that on or you won't be in the right place. And I'm just going to kind of straighten that out a little bit. That's good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. You'll see. Protection, and then let's go back into our plane and just make sure that it covers the clones pretty well. I'm going to pull that down a little bit. And you can see it's not perfectly square. But I've got it lined up fairly well. I may rotate that just a little bit more. All right. Okay. And so go ahead and just drag. Hopefully you get your texture in there. Go ahead and drag that onto our plane. And we want to, it could be a product of the plane. Let's do -y. Okay. All right. Let's not worry about that just yet. Okay. So what we want to do is take our texture, click on it, and control drag it to our cloner. All right. So if I switch this off a second, you see nothing's happening here. And I think the reason is because we deleted the texture tag, which is fine. So come over here and right click on this texture tag. And what we want to do is copy tag to children. Okay. So, and then once you've copied that, go ahead and delete the one from the cloner null. All right, so nothing's still showing up. All right, that's okay. So what we want to do is we want to select the top texture tag and go down to the bottom, shift click so that all those tags are selected. Now we want to go in and right click And I'd just do it on the top one, but they're still all selected. And what we want to do is fit to region. Now, I'm not clicking on this yet because once you click on this, you have one chance to do this. If it doesn't work the first time, then you reselect them if they go unselected and you got to do it again. So once you click this, see I've got this little crosshairs. Now I've got one chance to pull this where I want it. And I'm going to start at the bottom and go up because the top is narrower, so that'll should give me full coverage. So I'm going to place my cursor in the lower left corner. I'm going to click and drag to the right and drag up. Okay? As long as you don't let go of that, you can adjust to a point, and that looks good. So, okay. So now all of a sudden, if we click that off, you can see that we've got our logo on the clones and everything else. It doesn't look real great. It looks like it's been spray painted on, and that's just because of the way the editor is showing the texture preview size at the default. But if you put that at 1024 by 1024, right away it gets sharp. And then if we go ahead and do a quick render, you can see it's very sharp. But you can also see that it's a little hard to read. And even in my finished one it was. I probably should have chosen a different color for the eye or whatever. Anyway, a little trick that I use from time to time for stuff like this is to go in and turn on the luminance channel, and then in the color tab, click on this icon, drag it to the luminance, and then drop it in the texture window. All right, and then because we don't want this white to show through, when we just take the brightness to 0 and then start dragging this down a little bit until we're not really aware of the luminance so much, but it starts to fill in some of the shadows, and we get a little cleaner look to this. And about 12. And just so you can see the difference, and you can pull it up to, oh, that was great. You can pull it up to whatever you want. And of course, the other thing that's going to help it is we go in the default specular and crank the width down and the specular up, maybe a little wider than that. And so we get a little sharper looking image. Okay, so like I said, I'm not going to go into a whole lot about how you want to finish this out, how you want your finished spheres to look, adding reflection and whatever. But I did want to show you this luminance trick because it's kind of cool. And like my render was rendered with global illumination, you'll get a little extra pop from that too. 15 may be a little much. It's blowing out these spheres a little bit. I'll crank it back down to 12. All right, so but we're not done, okay? If I were to pull this back like so, well, actually, it is working, but I don't trust it, all right? Because we don't have any texture tags, all right? So with all these still selected, all right, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to say Generate UVW Coordinates. And that's going to place a texture tag on every one of these spheres, okay? All 1,000 of them, 1,051. And now you can be assured that when you back this off, that that texture is going to stay fixed on those spheres. All right, and we didn't get back into morph camera mode, so we got some weirdness going on, okay? And we still got some weirdness going on, but it's mostly in the camera. Oh no, that's actually looking pretty cool. So now we've got all our spheres spinning and landing in what looks like a very chaotic, haphazard way. But in reality, boom, and see, well, we got a nice little last minute drop in at the top of the S. I had mine happen on the L. And so that all looks pretty cool. And that's really kind of all there is to this. But I did want to show you one little trick that you may be able to use. I use it from time to time. It doesn't work for everything, but when it works, it's very cool. So I'm going to show you that next. So I feel like there was one thing I wasn't clear about, the reason for this plane. And this plane is just a guide And that's why I didn't care about whether the logo was upside down. It's just a guide so that when we selected all our texture tags and said fit to region, so that we had a region to fit it to. Because if you're just out here in space and you're trying to pull it and enclose all those, it's hard to do. And there's one other thing I failed to show, which is kind of important. If you're lucky and everything works out the way you want it, that's great. But if it doesn't, you still have options to reposition this logo on here. And if you select all these texture tags, you can do what you would do with any texture. You can move this around. You can squash it. It acts like a texture on a single object. Okay, and I did want to show you that because that's kind of important. So I wanted to show you one last thing. I told you, I know this tutorial is already getting a little long, but this is kind of a cool thing. I don't know if you looked at the intro video closely, but in the intro video, I mean, there's so much motion blur and everything else. Anyway, this is a DOF effect, a depth of field. And I don't know if you've played around with it in cinema, the native DOF and all the cameras and everything. And I've played around with it so much, and I've never been happy with it. And I've also tried different plugins, and usually I end up doing it in post. But there is a cool trick that I figured out once that works much of the time. So let's go up to the primitives and get a plane. And it's especially great if you just need some depth of field blur. Anyway, so let's get this plane in here, and it doesn't have to be exact. But you want it to cover, like, I'm going to get out of my morph camera for a second, so I'm just in the viewport. And you want it to cover the areas you want to be blurred. Now, I actually created a curved one. But once I show you what I'm doing here, you'll be able to adjust it to whatever you want blurred. So I'm going to go back in the morph camera, and okay, that all looks good. Okay, boom, boom, boom. All right. So this is kind of a crazy little trick I figured out, and it gets not involved, but anyway, just create a texture, put it on the plane. Let's just call this blur so we know what it is. And we're going to go into this texture. Oops, not that. I'm going to go in here, and we want to turn off reflection, and we want to turn on transparency. All right. And I can't remember. Yeah, I think we want to turn off color too. Okay, and so this probably looks pretty terrible. Anyway, as a matter of fact, maybe I can even go in here and let's see if, I don't know if that will help. I did something on my end. So anyway, so let's go back in here and into the transparency tab. And what we want to do is make sure there's no total internal reflections and no exit reflections. You want to leave this refraction at 1 because we don't really want any distortion, okay? And this absorption distance, I'm going to put that to 10. But you can play around with that, all right? And if you start cranking up this blurriness, and you don't have to do a lot. I think I may have used 8 on mine. And you can kind of see in this texture window, you can kind of get a feel for how much blurriness you have. So if we leave all these settings right where they are and I do a quick render, you're going to see I've already got blurriness going on. Okay? What's cool about this is the absorption distance actually controls the blur, giving less blur to objects close to the plane and more to objects farther away. From the top to the bottom. So in other words, just as just to show you what I mean, I'm going to move this up way up here. And what you're going to see is that the clones up towards the top of that plane aren't going to be as blurry as these down at the bottom. So let's just render that and you'll see what I mean. Okay? So you've got a little bit of blurriness here. You got just a slight little bit of blurriness there. But then you get down here and man, they are like blown out. So this works kind of cool. And it seems to work pretty well with global illumination. Now, the only time I've had a problem with it with ambient occlusion, because apparently ambient occlusion is a post effect. But on this piece, I used the global illumination with the built-in ambient occlusion, not as an added effect, and that did seem to work much better. Anyway, it's a cool way of adding some blur that you have so much control over. It's so easy. You just pull this plane up or down. You go into your transparency, and if you want more blur, you make it 12%. If you need the accuracy to be better, if you're not going to add any like motion blur, like I always add real smart motion blur to my final videos if there's a lot of movement like this. But you can add some more accuracy in. You will pay a price in the rendering, no doubt. But already you can see that's a much smoother blur. And you can crank the blur up even more, okay, until they're like smudges. All right, so you're almost like getting it's amazing. And so now you're starting to get some noise in there, and so you'd have to play around with these settings. But 52% of blur in this is like nuts almost. So I'm going to go back to 10. And this absorption distance is really important too. Like by default, it's 100, and you're not going to see much difference in these clones at the bottom. There's a little bit, okay? But that's the distance of how long it takes the blur to take effect. And here's another thing. This is by default white, but if you start adding color into this, and you got to be careful with the color because it changes fast. You may not notice it because I'm using the red. Yeah, you don't notice it so much. Let's put in blue, and okay, now you start to see it coloring those clones. And if you take this down to 10, you're going to really see these clones shift towards blue. There you go. Especially the farther they are away from the blur plane. But what's cool about it is you can see this is where that plane is. This is where the color starts. But and if let's say I do 50 on this and re-render it, now you're going to see a much more gradual change from the top of the plane down to the bottom. Here's another example using a single blur plane with green as the absorption color. So those are just some things to mess around with. It's kind of cool. But there's always a caveat. There's always a but. And I'm going to show you that but, and then we're going to be finished. I'm going to put a sky object in here. I'm going to find my what is it? My content browser, and I'm gonna just let's just use this thing. I forget which one I use. I think I use this one. That's good enough. We're gonna stick that on here, and I'm gonna put a compositing tag, and we're going to not seen, not by camera. Okay, so you start to render, and you go, oh, what's going on? I can see the plane, and actually what you're seeing is you're seeing some of the properties of this texture. All right. So first thing we want to do is we need a compositing tag. Oop, where are we? On there, so that all we do is we don't want any shadowing. We don't want transparency, refraction, reflection. We don't want that either. And actually, we just want seen by camera. Okay. Now, you're going to see that that still doesn't do the trick, okay? So now what we have to do is go into this compositing tag, and in the exclusion tab, you got to drag your blur plane in there, all right? Now if you render, you've got your blur without any picking up any of our sky object. And that's real important to remember that, because even when I was doing this, it had been so long since I'd used this technique, it was driving me crazy. But it does work really cool. And it seemed like there was something else I was going to tell you. I'm just going to add a little more blur to that so we can see a little better. 20, that's way overkill. Oh, I changed it to 2. Okay. So there you have it. So there's a little blur trick. Like I said, it doesn't work for everything, but it worked awesome on this to give me some blur down at the bottom, not that much. And I've used it on other animations and stuff where I just want to blur out a background real quick and I just don't want to composite it and everything. And it really works pretty cool most of the time. Anyway, so thanks for joining me for this tutorial, and I hope you have some fun with this, and see you next time.